one of the Democrats he was a lower level congressman, so forgive me for forgetting his name, but the Daily Caller News Foundation asked him about this today, saying, why did you choose not to clap or to stand for this 13-year-old who was given the Secret Service agent badge? He said, well, we respect people with cancer, but we don't respect Donald Trump and Elon Musk. So immediately negating the emotion of that moment and making it about the president and Elon Musk. And it's like, well, obviously you don't really respect it if you aren't willing to set aside your political differences for even 30 seconds to applaud.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Amber Duke, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks for having me, Brad.
Of course. We just witnessed a victory lap, to say the least.
Only 2 months in.
Only 2 months in, a victory lap about November, about the first 6 weeks of the administration. Some have told me it was the longest spoken address to a joint session of Congress. Trump knows that he's got the momentum. He's on a roll. What were your immediate takeaways from last night?
Well, I will start by saying that there were two things that Trump did that I thought were incredibly effective. Two strategies, we'll say, in terms of oration. The first was listing specific accomplishments from the administration, backing it up with data, and especially listing the examples of government waste, fraud, and abuse that DOJ has uncovered and forcing the Democrats to defend those. That was the first thing. The second thing was that there were a lot of moments in this address that were genuinely emotional and moving. Seeing Jocelyn Nungari's mother crying as Trump unveiled this executive order to rename a federal wildlife sanctuary after her. Seeing the parent and the sister of Laken Riley moved to tears by Trump's recognition of their daughter. That was the first piece of legislation he signed as president. And then giving the honorary Secret Service agent badge to the 13-year-old DJ who had always dreamed of being a police officer but couldn't do it because he spent the past 6 years battling brain cancer. And then the most effective part out of all of that is you had Democrats on the other side sitting down, refusing to clap, refusing to honor these ordinary Americans who have been benefited by the president's policies, and they came out of it looking like absolute clowns.
Yeah, this is what I think Trump has done well in previous State of the Unions as well. He front loads a lot of the conversation, a lot of we'll just call it boasting. When you do something as president, you ought to boast about it. Like, this is the nature of politics. You might like it, you might not like it, but you have to list your accomplishments and you have to say that they were good. And people are going to take that as boasting, whatever. But then later on in the speech, it becomes much more conversational, much more emotional, much more passionate. And then, of course, he uses those examples, those anecdotes, to really just drop the hammer one last time on a closing note. The genius part about front-loading policy conversations and kind of setting the stage with an aggressive message, right? He came on and he said, America is back. And he was not shy about connecting America being back to the victory he and Republicans got in November. The second thing was, we're on the cusp of this golden age, right? We're on the cusp of an American revival. And as soon as you see Democrats not standing or applauding for even a hypothetical or potential revival of the United States of America, you can just roll. And I think that was a massive notch in Trump's belt last night. Setting the tone in that way put Democrats on the back foot. And so they became completely unable to engage with anything emotional. I mean, they really looked cold-hearted through this whole thing.
Yeah, and one of the Democrats he was a lower-level congressman, so forgive me for forgetting his name, but the Daily Caller News Foundation asked him about this today, saying, why did you choose not to clap or to stand for this 13-year-old who was given the Secret Service agent badge or induction as a Secret Service agent, honorary agent? And he said, well, we respect people with cancer, but we don't respect Donald Trump and Elon Musk. So immediately negating the emotion of that moment and making it about the president and Elon Musk. And it's like, well, obviously you don't really respect it if you aren't willing to set aside your political differences for even 30 seconds to applaud. The other thing that I thought was really unique about this speech, Brad, is that typically it's a State of the Union effectively, but they don't call it that during the first time that the president does this in his first month or two in office. But it was a State of the Union for Trump. It wasn't just a joint address to Congress, because typically the president comes in the first year, they give this address, they're talking about the things that are wrong with the country and what they're going to do throughout their administration to fix it. Well, Trump's already been fixing it. He's already accomplished a lot in his first 6 weeks. So it sounded like the type of speech that you would hear in year 2, year 3, even year 4, even this early on in the admin.
Yeah. You mentioned previously Doge, and connecting Doge to the vigorous actions of President Donald Trump. I mean, this is the energetic executive that Alexander Hamilton talks about in the Federalist Papers. Like it or not, this is something that the founders completely accounted for, was just a robust executive coming in when the country's in a bad spot and really challenging, in some ways good, in some ways, I won't say not good, but really like
testing the limits.
Yeah, and a contest between good, I think, well-thinking Republicans in the legislature who want to protect legislative power versus good, well-thinking conservatives in the executive branch who want to do as much as they can to fix the problems that Joe Biden caused. And so, that vigorous activity, I think what you really saw was the political utility of Doge. Like, a lot of us are so happy that conservatives now have these different contracts to point to at Doge.gov and say, look at where your taxpayer dollars are going. Boom, 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 boom. Studying gender transition in mice, sending Sesame Street in Iraq, millions of dollars to gender theory in Liberia or whatever, right? That's been a super useful tool. I don't think it's ever been as powerfully presented as it was last night during that State of the Union.
Well, it was just so specific. And there are things that are indefensible that the president listed. I mean, Sesame Street in Iraq for what, $20 million? Yeah, it's doing a great job of promoting unity. Or in Afghanistan even, the Taliban's in charge. Obviously, your Sesame Street isn't working. And I think, this is a reminder to Republicans of what you can accomplish with just a little bit of political will, which in the past they haven't been too fond of using, even using executive powers. And now they've seen the immense change that can happen, positive change that can happen when you have someone at the helm who's willing to use the powers that are afforded to him. And I would also say to Republicans in Congress, you're at fault here too, right? You're the ones who passed these massive omnibus spending bills that included a lot of these contracts. And with USAID specifically, one of the biggest problems is that Congress wanted to offload its responsibility for what was happening. So they intentionally wrote vague legislation that gave the executive, the unelected bureaucrats, tons of power to decide precisely how that money was distributed. Well, now that we've seen what the unelected bureaucrats were spending that money on, let's say Congress passes a social cohesion program for Afghanistan, and the decision made by the unelected bureaucrats is to create the Sesame Street. Well, Congress, you need to take responsibility for your actions, and you need to write legislation that is actually specific and in line with what your goals are. Otherwise, the executive is going to have free reign. And now the Democrats are seeing the flip side of that. The flip side is that when a Republican who wants to use executive power is in office, your pet projects, your funding to liberal NGOs, all of your social theory programs that are being exported abroad are going to be canceled.
No, it's such a good point. A question of political will. And Trump has that will, and that will, I think, was on display last night for sure. Republican administrations, Republican members of Congress in years past would say, this is great that Doge is uncovering all this waste, but goodness, I mean, the messaging, the corporate media, the insecurity that Doge is creating by throwing these wrenches into the system, by being the disruptor it promised it would be. I mean, I think you'd see many Republicans in years past just completely back off of it. But we haven't seen that. We've seen Republicans in Congress really come alongside the president. And I just, it's like not even thinkable that this would be on the table, let alone, in 2020 when the president lost, of course, we thought there would be some sort of comeback in some form, as President Trump said, as he left Washington, D.C. in 2021. But I mean, let alone in 2016, I think a lot of us didn't think numbers like this would have been possible. Support like this wouldn't have been possible. Unity like this in Republican ranks wouldn't have been possible. Yes, there's occasionally, a town hall where one member of Congress throws some questions about what Elon Musk is doing at Doge. But for the most part, I mean, the Republican approval rating of President Donald Trump is through the roof. And the Republican unity right now, because we're not in the middle of budget reconciliation, seems higher than ever. The House actually agreeing to go forward with potentially a budget reconciliation bill that passes everything in one bill. The Senate, working in close coordination with the House after moving to put a little pressure on Mike Johnson to move, is now saying, yes, we will take up this one bill strategy as well. I mean, given the way Trump won in 2016, even people in Republican politics were saying, yeah, I mean, he pulled out a straight flush on the river.
Yeah.
Right? He's not actually in the driver's seat here. A lot of us in Congress thought that we won in spite of Trump, not because of Trump. And 2024 is that test case to prove actually Republicans have had control. Anytime Republicans have had control in the last decade and a half, it's because of President Donald Trump and his policies and his popularity. Yeah, and they realize that. And they also realize that Trump has effectively grabbed the 80% on a lot of 80-20 issues, whether it's cutting government waste. There was a poll from the Washington Post, Harris X Washington Post, I believe, just a couple of weeks ago that found 76% of Americans agree with cutting waste. And, people will argue, well, it depends on how you do it, but they're broadly supportive of the idea. And so far, the waste that Trump's identified has been, again, indefensible. He's on the 80% side of the transgender athletes in sports issue, on a lot of cultural issues, frankly. And so there's just no argument from establishment Republicans that Trump does not have a mandate and that the American people are not supportive of his agenda. And just based on people that I've talked to in Congress, they're viewing what Trump is doing with his executive power as a roadmap for what they need to codify with legislation. Because, of course, as we know, Congress appropriates money. You can't just set it on fire if you don't like where it's going. You either do a pause, as Trump has been doing, and try to reallocate what you can, and then the rest of it's eventually going to have to go out. But you do need Congress in future reconciliation bills to make sure that those things that Doge is identifying are not included. So that's going to be the challenge for them, is making sure that they are staying strong-willed throughout the budgetary process to get all of this stuff killed once and for all. Mm-hmm. Taking a victory lap. Victory in November, victory in the first 6 weeks, victory over the Democrats. I mean, just completely humiliating them in the joint session. But victory in one key issue in particular, the defining issue, arguably, of the 2024 campaign, because it does relate to the economy, it does relate to trade, it does relate to foreign policy, and that was immigration. Trump took a victory lap saying that February border encounters were the lowest they've been in decades. That is true. In January, border enforcement encountered 43,000 migrants. In February, it was down to 29,000. That was the lowest levels since fiscal year 2000. Mind-blowing. Not something that I think anyone would have expected, even if you were sitting there on, January 21st, 2021, saying Donald Trump's going to come back. He's going to become president of the United States, and he's going to continue acting on the border. But I mean, record lows since fiscal year 2000 set in the month of February. Whoa, mind-blowing. I mean, the source of this, how is Trump having so much success on this issue in the span of just 6 weeks? It's a combination of policy and of posture, because a lot of illegal aliens are self-deporting because they don't want to get caught up in the mass deportation operation. And a lot are choosing not to cross the border in the first place because they believe now that the border is secure.
one of the number one key things that Trump has done is end catch and release, which, as you know, previously, if a migrant was caught at the southern border by Border Patrol, they would get an ankle monitor or they would have to check in on the CBP One app and they would be released into the interior of the United States. Guess what? Most of them don't show up for their court hearings. So it's basically a free pass to be here in perpetuity when you're not doing deportations. Well, now if you get caught at the southern border, you're going back, right? CBP is not going to sit there and release you into the U.S. You are going home. And if you come back a second time, the penalties are even going to be more severe. So a lot of people are choosing not to even try. But the ones that are trying are encountering a more robust Border Patrol force. And one of the big elements here is the recent deal that Trump got out of Mexico, thanks to his threat of instituting a 25% tariff. The Mexican National Guard has deployed 10,000 troops around their side of the border. And one thing that blew my mind, we had a reporter, Robert McGreevy, who recently embedded with the Mexican National Guard. I was shocked to learn this. I'm sure a lot of people don't know this. There were no vehicle checks taking place on the Mexican side of the border, only on the U.S. side. Well, now they are doing vehicle checks. And sure, it slows down how quickly you can get from Tijuana to Baja California and then up to the U.S. portion of California. But guess what? You're actually catching the illegal drug flows, the human trafficking before they ever even cross into the United States. You're getting multiple sets of eyes on these vehicles, so you're not entirely reliant on American border enforcement to catch these things. That's a huge component here. And the National Guard is also breaking up well-known human trafficking spots for cartels and coyotes in rural places in Mexico where there either isn't a border wall or there's known that there's not a lot of U.S. border agents waiting on the other side. The National Guard is now there catching these people before they even get across the border in the first place. So it's taken a lot of the lift off of CBP.
Yeah, Rob's reporting has been phenomenal on this. Being in there with Mexican National Guard as they do this. One of the most interesting aspects I found from his reporting was realizing just how little the incentive is for the Mexican government to do anything. And I'm not talking just about Mexico as a nation state writ large, but actually the political class in Mexico. They have little to no incentive to do anything unless there is a threat from the United States like tariffs. The reason that they don't have this threat is because, one, they already don't have territorial control of some of the regions of their countries. The cartels have territorial control. And with that territorial control comes real power, not just monetary power. When you have essentially bases where you can retreat to and do operations out of, well, we saw during I believe there's like dozens of assassinations last time Mexico had nationwide elections. And those assassinations were carried out by members of the cartel to no surprise whatsoever. So you already have the cartels, and you're thinking, okay, if we don't just let drugs go into the United States as quickly as possible, then now the drugs stay here, or the drugs find different homes in different localities close to the border. And then, of course, to protect those drugs, you have more cartel members, right, staking out different territorial claims to make sure that they protect their operations. So for the Mexican government on the drug side, on the basically counterterrorism operation side, they don't have much of incentive to slow down the Mexican cartels at all. The second thing is any Mexican who works in the United States but is a Mexican citizen and lives in Mexico, right? They want to make sure that their commute is as easy and quick as possible from Tijuana to the United States. Why? Because they're working an American job, they're getting an American wage, and where are those wages going? Going back into Mexico, right? Remittances, we've talked a little bit about taxing remittances, whether that's on the federal level or it's on the state level like Oklahoma is doing. The United States is the biggest sender of remittances in the world. And for viewers who don't know what a remittance is, it's you work a job in the United States and you take that money back home to your family in whatever country they may be living in. $85 billion in 2023 were wages earned in the United States and then taken back to a different country. $30 billion of that, give or take, went back to Mexico. So if you make the commute harder, if you put more barriers for Mexican workers to work American jobs and you're the Mexican government, well, you could lose $30 billion from your economy, specifically in northern Mexican territories where it's already very, very poor.
And for people who blush at the idea of taxing remittances and say, well, we believe in the free movement of money, understand that, I'll just give one example. Canada does this to the United States all the time. Look at the Digital Services Act. If you are Instagram, let's say, and you're obviously operating globally, if there's a Canadian influencer who's making $1 million a year on Instagram, Instagram obviously gets a cut of that profit, whether it's from ad sales or, boosts that they get from Instagram Reels, et cetera. Canada actually taxes Instagram on their profit that they earn from a Canadian influencer. So they're losing a significant amount of tax money. The U.S. obviously is no longer able to tax that full profit, so they're losing out on federal revenue as well. That money's not being reinvested back into the United States. So it's totally fair game, fair trade, not free trade, for us to do the same to those countries that they're doing to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Canada is, of course, a big topic of conversation. I think we're recording this Wednesday. Today in the briefing room, Caroline Leavitt received a question about putting tariffs on Canada, and that the president is obviously not pleased with what the Trudeau government has promised thus far to do about drug trade or any other concessions that the Canadian government could give to prevent these American tariffs from going into place on Canadian goods. They kept saying to Caroline Leavitt, it's only 43 pounds of fentanyl.
Oh,
for those who don't, it can fit in a suitcase, they could check it on TSA. For those who don't know, fentanyl, 43 pounds of fentanyl is enough to kill almost 10 million Americans,
right,
because the lethal dose of fentanyl is 2 milligrams. If you are a fully functioning Western nation, and you are sharing a border with the United States, you are letting poison come in from China to kill American citizens, right? The number one leading death in the 19 to 45 age demographic is fentanyl poisoning at this point. The acceptable level is 0. Now, is 0 something that we can actually achieve? No, of course not, because there's always going to be bad actors. Things are going to get away. But, this whole line that Canada doesn't deserve it is ridiculous to me. And also, Canada is at the border with people giving migrants hugs because they've been so traumatized by the U.S. government's treatment of these migrant people. Canada is a massive magnet for illegal immigration coming up from Mexico and from Northern Triangle countries, from the entire southern part of the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, and I think it increased 300% during the Biden administration, both in terms of human and drug trafficking. If you were in New Hampshire during any of the primaries this past year, you saw firsthand the devastating effects of fentanyl there. That's become a huge market for it. A lot of hollowed out northern industrial cities, fentanyl is a huge problem. And yeah, we can do better than 43 pounds. I remember back when I was working at The Spectator, I went and did a profile of a DA in Long Island, and he was actually introducing a bill to increase penalties for individuals who, in the process of drug trafficking, kill police officers with fentanyl. Because when police go to break up these fentanyl rings, if there's even a trace amount on a table, if it gets on their fingers, and they accidentally ingest it, that can be enough to kill somebody. It really only takes a trace amount. And they were finding that being able to increase penalties on killing of cops through fentanyl poisoning could help to mitigate some of the drug traffickers. But that's just to provide an example of really how little it takes to kill somebody.
Yeah. And, you actually talk to people on the left. I just watch them. I don't really have many liberal friends anymore. Shocker.
Me
welcome.
neither.
But you actually you're contractually obligated to talk to these people at some point. On the show Rising, if folks haven't checked it out, please do check it out. It's a way that I get my news. Last night, no applause for Jocelyn's family. No applause for Lake and Riley's family. We have been told Democrats in disarray. Democrats have even told us they are in disarray and that they are going to do soul searching. We've seen this before. In 2016, they said, well, we don't understand the American people as well as we should. This is corporate media outlets in the left, so we're going to do some soul searching. Last night showed that they haven't done any of that. I mean, what is that?
Well, the fundamental problem I see with the Democrats is that when they say soul searching, they don't mean changing their policies, they mean changing their message. And that's where they run into issues, because you can jazz up a message. You can use whatever strategery you want to try to change the way that you're talking about issues. But if you have bad policies, there's no way to message around that. And they've been very clear that they don't want to abandon, let's say, the women in sports issue or the women's sports issue with transgender biological male athletes competing in women's sports. You had one congressman Seth Moulton indicate that he was not supportive of this. He has a daughter who plays in sports. He doesn't think it's fair. And several of his staffers immediately resigned, and the Democratic Party chastised him publicly and basically rapped him on his knuckles for daring to say the quiet part out loud. So they can say that they're going to try to change what they're doing to attract more Americans, but really what they mean is they just want to lie better.
Yeah, that's crazy to me. I mean, Seth Moulton is actually, I think, an interesting person, like flopped as a presidential candidate, progressive, loon, whatever, but one of the early people to talk out about the forever wars in the Middle East, talking out now about the transgender issue. And I don't know, I just think it's there has to be some pathology on the left in particular that prevents them from ever walking away.
It's ideological purity. It's cult-like, where you have to abide by every Democratic Party line or else you get kicked out. I mean, if you go back 10 years to really when Trump was coming up in the political scene, they pushed out the Connor Lambs. They made an enemy of the Joe Manchins. Any pro-life Democrats need not apply. And that's continued until today, where you see them pushing out people like Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr., who are now members of the Trump administration because they broke with the party on several issues that the party wasn't ready to turn tide on. So they are more than willing to kick people out if they don't feel like they are adhering to every element of the DNC platform.
Yeah, and to bring it back to the speech on Tuesday, afterwards, Axelrod on CNN, David Axelrod and Scott Jennings went back and forth, and Axelrod said, you know, it's a mistake, in my opinion, for Democrats to say that they are not for finding the waste, because if they're finding waste, that means that more taxpayer dollars can actually be going to the people who these programs are meant or designed to help. And Scott Jennings jumped on that, of course, and said, yeah, that's all good and fun, but, Republicans are absolutely loving some of the chaos, and sob stories about fired federal workers just ain't going to cut it, right?
No.
That said, I think Axelrod made a pretty fair point here, which is if Democrats can't get out of their own way, they're going to be facing a long electoral winter. I mean, as we look at the next few years, what's Democrats' way back? Because I can't help but notice that Slotkin, in her response, Alyssa Slotkin, the new senator from Michigan, was invoking the name of Reagan at multiple points. And if you're invoking the name of Reagan to fit into the left side of the Overton window right now in American politics, that means the right is winning in a big way.
Yeah, I don't see where else they go besides trying to make attack back to the center, but I just don't believe that the American people will view that as authentic. A lot of these people who are now trying to moderate on issues just 2-3 years ago were taking the opposite position. Alyssa Slotkin's a great example. She was for electric vehicle mandates and green energy mandates from the Biden EPA before she realized that that wasn't going to go over well in Michigan, where you have massive auto workers unions and reshoring of automobile manufacturing. And those people might actually be out of work if your policies go into effect. And it was a similar problem with Kamala Harris in the last presidential election. They kept telling us, no, really, she's moderate. She's actually not a progressive Democrat. Well, her record speaks for herself. So you can only do so much when you're on the record as having voted for certain policies, publicly supported certain policies. No one's going to believe that you suddenly had an overnight transformation.
Yeah, you know my wife. She's from Northern Michigan. Go tell a Northern Michigander that they need an electric vehicle when it's negative 20 degrees outside. It ain't going to go over well for you. But I think that really puts a good point on it, which is this tack back to the center is almost impossible for the Democratic Party to pull off. And there's a part of me that hopes that they can pull off some sort of genuine tack to the center, because the alternative really scares the heck out of me. If they are beholden, bought and paid for by their activist class, if they ever get power again, it's going to be really destructive because they're not going to have the demos backing them up. They're not going to have, popular support running cover for their agenda. It's going to be force, whether that's force from the executive or force from the legislature. It's going to be packing the court. It's going to be ending the filibuster. It's going to be actually doing they hope to do what Joe Biden tried to do on the last day in office, which was, I have tweeted and changed the Constitution.
Right.
You remember that?
Yes.
But that's scary as all get out.
It is scary, but I will say the one benefit of that is if these policies continue to be as unpopular as they are now, which I don't really see Americans suddenly abandoning all common sense, it's going to be a huge problem for them electorally. So I don't know how they can move further left and cater even harder to the Democratic activist class and expect to win elections, at least not to the point where they're going to have control of the entire government. And I don't think the Democrats are ready or willing to abandon the activist class because that's about 20% of their base. And they've cobbled together this deranged coalition of people who believe all sorts of very incomprehensible things that are at conflict with one another. I mean, you compare, for example, the Democrats have the majority of the Muslim vote, but then they also are in bed with transgender activists. Those two things don't go together. And we saw actually a huge problem for them with their Jewish base and Muslim base in the primary leading up to this past election in 2024.
Trump turned Israel into a Rorschach test, and it worked out great for him.
Exactly. Yeah. So they have to find a new base before they can effectively make a move to the center. But who's going to be part of that new base? They tried to make it the former neoconservatives, the Liz Cheney fans, but those are dwindling in number 2. So I don't see how they can grab enough people with the policies they've previously supported and the ones they might in the future to make them electorally significant.
Yeah, and a disaster too, because bringing in the Cheneys undercut their credibility with the activist class,
That's right?
That's not a ethnic divide necessarily. That is a class divide, that is a ideological divide that cannot be bridged.
Right. I mean, this feels like when you have a college basketball team, a bunch of the players leave, they transfer to another school, you get a new head coach, and really it's a rebuilding year. And the goal of the head coach is to have new recruits, new positive recruits coming out of high school. That's a long process typically. For college basketball, it takes probably a few years. For a political party, I imagine it takes even longer because you're talking about millions of people.
Check this segue out. Speaking of new recruits, MSDNC has had to bring in some new recruits.
Love that.
I thought you would.
Well done.
Thank you. Folks are leaving the network, such as Joy Reid. The Trump campaign completely circumvented corporate media, went to alternative media platforms, went on Joe Rogan, did the podcast thing. And the corporate media, meanwhile, decided that they were going to try to install an empty pantsuit in the White House. It was a true test of how much power they still had. And they figured out that they don't have nearly as much power as they thought they did. We all know Trump is good for ratings, but it looks like corporate media is on a ventilator. And we know from COVID, when you go on a ventilator, there's no coming back.
It doesn't end well.
It doesn't end well. Media in the Trump 2.0 era, I mean, media in Trump 1.0 was great for ratings like CNN's and Fox News's, but now people are just done.
Yeah, I think with corporate media in particular, MSNBC and CNN, a lot of conservatives tuned into them during the first admin because they were curious about what they were saying, what the message was. I think now they don't care and they've tuned it out because they view them as appropriately irrelevant. But the other problem for those outlets is that they, for 8 years, were on a screed against Trump. Every bit of their programming was about Trump. And if it wasn't about Trump, it was complaining about Fox News. Well, how many times, even if you're a deranged liberal and you watch MSNBC because you think Rachel Maddow's the greatest thing since sliced bread, how many times can MSNBC tell you that the walls are closing in on Trump before you start to realize, wait a second, the walls are not only not closing in, Trump just won re-election, Republicans won the House and the Senate, his policies are overwhelmingly popular, he has a great approval rating, none of the indictments stuck on him, he's not going to prison like you promised me. Maybe you guys have been overpromising me what was going to happen to Trump, and I don't really trust you anymore.
One of the interesting things, too, is I've noticed smart Democrats wanting to basically build. I mean, conservatives were so far outside of corporate media for the longest time that as soon as we had the opportunity with the rise of the digital age and media to build alternative pipelines and infrastructure for a media apparatus, we did that. Left didn't have to worry about it. Then now with Trump circumventing corporate media and winning the presidency with this alternative media strategy, you see folks like the Pod Save America guys going on Barstool podcasts or going on, like, I don't know if they did Theo Vaughn, but, doing the...
And they had Bill Maher on their show recently.
Right, doing the junket. And that's actually way more interesting to me. And I think they're struggling to do it well, as we saw from the copy-paste video script right before the joint address on Tuesday with Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer and 27 other Democrats doing these fake videos with the predetermined script and all that stuff, right? But nevertheless, like, there is a genuine effort, I think, from the smart people on the left to build this alternate media apparatus. Do you think they're capable of doing that?
I just don't know how that works when your biggest talking heads are all Democratic operatives. The thing that worked about the right-wing media space, for lack of a better term, is that most of the people who had the biggest audiences were not explicitly political. They talked about politics, but they weren't really political people. Like, Joe Rogan is not really a political guy. Theo Vaughn's not a political guy. Neither have worked in a Republican administration. And they weren't having politicians on their podcasts all the time. And when they were, Theo Vaughn had Bernie Sanders like a month before he had Donald Trump on. They were talking about the issues as they saw them as people just living in the world. The Pod Save America guys are all ex-Obama alum. So the intent of trying to be in the independent media space doesn't work because they're not independent people. They are offshoots of the corporate media apparatus. And on MSNBC, okay, you kick out crazy person Joy Reid, but who else do you have on staff? Oh, yeah, Jen Psaki and Simone Sanders, who both worked for the Biden administration, and Nicole Wallace, who was one of the neocon Bush staffers, who immediately after the joint address to Congress decides to say that the problem with Trump giving the Secret Service agent honorable award was that he has to worry that Trump supporters are going to kill him during another raid on the Capitol, or he might kill himself. I mean, that's the kind of deranged commentary that you're getting.
Yeah. I want to close with this because it kind of wraps it all up. This was a YouGov CBS News poll right after the speech. Now, granted, this poll sampled 51% Republicans, 27% independents, and 20% Democrats. Even with that right-wing skew, I think these numbers are fascinating. Views of President Trump's speech among those polled: 76% approved, 23% disapproved. Time Trump spent on issues you care about: 63% said a lot, 28% said a little, 9% said none at all. Speech made you feel: 68% said hopeful, 54% said proud, 27% said worried, 16% said angry. In the speech, Trump was 74% presidential, 74% entertaining, no surprise there. Thought that one would have been higher. 71% inspiring, 62% unifying, only 46% divisive. Like Trump's plans for waste in government spending, like 77, dislike 23. Immigration and border, like 77, dislike 23. Ukraine and Russia, like 73, dislike 27. Tariffs, 65% like, 35% dislike. Trump described crime problem as 68, about as it is, 22% worse than it is, 10% not as bad as it really is. I mean, this just kind of sums up everything that we're talking about because numbers like this would have been unheard of. I said this during the campaign when support for mass deportations hit 50%. Unheard of in the world that we've been living in the last 10 years, pushing for sensible immigration policy in this country. And now here we are, first joint session of Congress, 6 weeks in, 76% approve of President Donald Trump's message.
It's crazy. I think in a lot of ways, Trump has to be thankful to losing in 2020 because Americans needed to see how bad it could get. And after 4 years of the Biden administration, which was supposed to be the return to normalcy, adults in the room, you're not going to get the 24/7 Trump news cycle. A lot of people had Trump fatigue. Well, guess what? None of that happened. In fact, it was worse than anyone could have predicted. It was 4 years of chaos, of weakness on the world stage, of a border invasion, massive inflation, making everyday goods unaffordable. And now that Trump is in office and governing not even just the way he did in 2016, far beyond that, it's like a breath of fresh air. And I don't think you could have had those numbers if he had just served a second term back to back.
Amber Duke, thank you for coming on the Signal Sit-Down. But before we go, where can people find you and your work?
Absolutely. People can find me on Twitter at Amber Marie Duke. My work is on dailycaller.com. And also check out my shows on The Hills Rising on Fridays and at Reason Free Media with Robbie Suave.
Well, that does it for us on the Signal Sit-Down. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit-Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.